A deadly prescription hides more than intent. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axon. Drop a comment and share where you're listening from today. Your messages always make this journey richer. Now, let's begin. The morning began, as most in Flaxborough did, with a faint sense of duty. The high street was already awake. Mrs. Gloss, of the florists, was watering her chrysanthemums with an air of moral superiority. The milk lorry grumbled past the Methodist chapel, and on the green outside the library, two council workmen debated whether the bench they were painting should be labelled wet or damp. By 10 o'clock, the Flaxborough Ladies' Pharmaceutical Circle had convened in the function room of the Corn Exchange. Its purpose, nominally, was to promote hygiene and understanding between the professions, though in truth it functioned as a polite excuse for its members to gossip with the force of a minor storm front. Mrs. Ada Reckitt, wife of the town's senior chemist, presided. She was a woman of unbending composure and considerable bust, both of which lent moral weight to her every pronouncement. Seated nearest the urn was Miss Dotty Slattery, who ran the dispensing counter, and who, it was said, knew more about the private ailments of Flaxborough's population than did any doctor or priest alive. "It's not for me to say," Miss Slattery was saying as she stirred her tea, "but I've always thought a little less bromide and a little more backbone might have saved half the marriages in this town." A ripple of knowing laughter passed around the table. From his post at the far end, Councillor Dobson, invited on account of his role in public health matters, though more for his tendency to flatter, cleared his throat. "Quite right, Miss Slattery. A tonic society is a healthy society. We can't afford moral weakness." The irony of a man whose wife ran the town's unlicensed slimming clinic making such pronouncements escaped him entirely. At precisely 10:30, just as Mrs. Reckitt began to read from her paper the role of camphor in civic virtue, a strangled gasp interrupted her. Mrs. Mercy Platt, a timid widow and occasional volunteer at the library, had gone quite grey and dropped her cup into her saucer with a small but decisive crash. A thin trickle of tea, unbothered by the drama, seeped down the tablecloth. "Oh, heavens! Mercy!" cried Mrs. Reckitt. "Quick, some air!" Miss Slattery, brisk and unflustered, was at the woman's side within seconds. "Air won't do her much good if she's already taken something," she murmured. By the time the town ambulance arrived, its siren too embarrassed to make much noise, Mrs. Platt was beyond persuasion. A single prescription bottle, its label neatly torn in half, was found in her handbag. It bore, just visible, the word tonic. By lunchtime, the news had overtaken every other matter of interest. At the railway buffet, Miss Lucy Teetle, who regarded gossip as a moral responsibility, relayed the tale to a captivated audience of two. Dropped dead, right there in front of Mrs. Reckitt. Some say her last words were, "Not again," though that might just be the echo of the teacup. At the bar of the Market Hotel, the story was less delicate. "Poisoned herself, you mark me," declared Mr. Crabtree, the fishmonger. "Those tonics they hand out these days, half strychnine and half scandal." The local newspaper, the Flaxborough Citizen, postponed its planned feature on safety in knitting to prepare a special column. Mysterious death at ladies' meeting. Tonic tragedy in Flaxborough. Inspector Purbright was not a man easily surprised. His calm, mildly amused face could have been carved by an artisan of understatement. When Sergeant Malley entered his office with the report, Purbright was midway through pouring himself a cup of tea. "Dead at the Corn Exchange, sir. Mrs. Mercy Platt. Looks like something she took." Purbright's eyebrows rose slightly. "Took voluntarily?" "That's just it, sir. There's a bottle of tonic, label half missing. Could be one of Reckitt's." "Ah." Purbright sipped thoughtfully. "Mrs. Reckitt does like to keep the town in good health. Sometimes to death." He set down his cup, sighed gently, and reached for his coat. Outside, Flaxborough went about its business with prim indifference. Curtains twitched, words whispered, reputations rearranged. Somewhere between the florist and the post office, a small, quiet crime had taken root, and Inspector Purbright, smiling faintly, went to see what sort of seed it was. Inspector Purbright arrived at the Corn Exchange just as the last of the ambulance attendants was wheeling away the late Mrs. Platt under a shroud of municipal propriety. A small crowd had gathered, drawn less by curiosity about death than by its impeccable timing. It was, after all, market day, and there was always the chance of seeing someone they knew involved in something newsworthy. The smell of damp chrysanthemums from Mrs. Gloss's stall drifted in the air, lending a faintly funereal note to proceedings. Sergeant Malley, notebook poised like a bayonet, stepped forward. Witnesses all agree she went pale, then stiffened, then dropped the cup, sir. He nodded toward the tea-stained tablecloth inside. Doctor says heart failure, but he's not committing himself till the post-mortem. Purbright surveyed the room with mild interest. The Corn Exchange was not a place built for drama. Its high windows and pale paintwork lent an air of civic decency, as though scandal could not quite gain traction on its varnished floors. Yet scandal, like dust, had a way of settling. Mrs. Ada Reckitt stood near the doorway, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that might once have been lace. Her distress was genuine, but so too was her awareness of how she looked, in distress. "Oh, Inspector," she began, her voice quavering just enough to be noticed. "It was dreadful. Simply dreadful. Poor Mercy. She'd seemed so delicate lately, always asking about tonics, poor dear. I do wonder if she might have misunderstood something I told her." Purbright inclined his head. "About a tonic." Mrs. Reckitt hesitated, a pause so brief it could almost have been mistaken for modesty. "Yes, a mild restorative I recommended. Perfectly harmless in moderation, of course. Though, now I think of it, she was most insistent about wanting something stronger. I told her, naturally, that only a qualified chemist could dispense that sort of thing." "Indeed. And did she obtain it?" "I couldn't say. I advised her to speak to my husband, but she seemed reluctant. I had the impression she, didn't entirely approve of men behind pharmacy counters." Purbright allowed himself the smallest of smiles. A very particular moral objection, no doubt. He turned to Miss Slattery, who was still hovering by the tea-urn, watchful and faintly exhilarated. "Miss Slattery," he said, "you were the first to reach Mrs. Platt." The woman straightened her spectacles with brisk efficiency. "Yes, Inspector. I thought at first she'd only fainted, but then her lips went that awful color. Not the sort you get from shock. More chemical, if you take my meaning." Purbright took it quietly, filing it away among other impressions. The nervous flutter of Mrs. Reckitt's hands, the self-satisfied precision in Miss Slattery's tone, and, perhaps most tellingly, the way Councillor Dobson kept glancing toward the half-empty bottle now sealed in a police evidence bag on the table. "Mr. Dobson," Purbright said gently, "you were present throughout." The councillor's ample face flushed with the effort of dignity. Yes. Most distressing. I was addressing the meeting about the new public health regulations when, the interruption occurred. I must say, Inspector, it was an unfortunate coincidence. I'd just been remarking on the dangers of self-medication." "How prophetic," murmured Purbright. "And did you happen to see the deceased consume her tea or any other substance?" "No, I was looking at my notes. She seemed perfectly attentive a moment before." "Quite." Purbright dismissed them all for the moment, leaving Malley to record statements. Outside, the town clock struck 11 with bureaucratic punctuality. He paused on the steps, breathing the cool air that smelled faintly of varnish and gossip. By afternoon, the story had grown new appendages. At the post office, it was said that Mrs. Platt had been heard arguing about a bill for a prescription 2 days before. At the Green Man, someone swore she'd mentioned putting an end to it all in the presence of gin. And at the library, where speculation thrived in the quiet corners between shelves, Miss Peebles, the librarian, whispered that Mrs. Platt had recently taken to reading medical almanacs with unnerving intensity. Purbright, for his part, listened to none of it directly. He preferred the filtered version, which Sergeant Malley obligingly supplied between mouthfuls of sandwiches. "They're all saying she meant to do herself in, sir, though if that's true, she picked a funny place for it, half the town watching her drink her tea." "Quite so," said Purbright, leaning back in his chair. "Suicide, in my experience, rarely enjoys an audience, except perhaps in politics." He gazed at the report on his desk, the neat handwriting of the attending doctor stating, "Death consistent with ingestion of toxic compound, possibly strychnine derivative." The word possibly had a careful, almost apologetic curl to it. Purbright admired such caution in others. It left room for thought. At 5 o'clock, he walked down to Reckitt's chemist's. The bell over the door tinkled with exaggerated innocence. Mr. Reckitt himself, a man of pale complexion and anxious neatness, emerged from behind the counter. "Ah, Inspector Purbright," he said too quickly. "Terrible business, simply terrible. My wife told me you'd been asking about poor Mrs. Platt." Purbright nodded amiably. "A sad affair. I gather she was one of your customers?" "Yes, indeed. Frequently so, though, not for anything dangerous. Mostly tonics, sleeping draughts and such. Nothing out of the ordinary." "Would you happen to recall dispensing anything to her recently?" Reckitt blinked. "Last week, perhaps. Something restorative, though she did come in again yesterday, asking for a renewal. I refused naturally. She looked rather overwrought. Said she had some left." Purbright's gaze drifted to a shelf of amber bottles, each with its little white label, lined up like soldiers in a parade. "You're quite sure of that?" "Oh, yes. And I keep records of every sale. You're welcome to inspect them." "I shall, thank you, but perhaps tomorrow. I wouldn't wish to keep you late." Reckitt's relief was immediate and unconvincing. Outside, the lamps were being lit along the high street, their reflections trembling in the puddles left by an afternoon shower. Purbright paused under one, glancing back at the chemist's window where a small placard read, "Health is the town's greatest wealth." He smiled faintly. In Flaxborough, he thought, that particular currency was always in questionable circulation. The rain hesitated and left the high street merely polished. Purbright walked from the chemist's without hurry. Under Reckitt's window, a thin scrap of paper had caught on the gutter. He prized it up with his pen. A loop of an elegant letter showed beneath a faint gold border, more flourish than Reckitt would tolerate. He folded the scrap into his notebook and went on. The station had the after-tea quiet, in which everything sounds official. Malley glanced up. "Dr. Vivers called, sir. Preliminary in the morning. He wants to know what the bottle held." "Something that resented being tasted," said Purbright. He laid the damp scrap on blotting paper. As it dried, the gold line sharpened. The font was jaunty. "Does Mrs. Dobson label her slimming cordial like a duchess signs photographs?" "Nottingham printer," said Malley. "Curly letters. She buys sugar syrup by the crate and orange flavoring by the quart. And permission to sell strength. She calls it detox. That's a permission some people sign for themselves." Night passed with the industry of a small ship. Reports filled, telephone answered, nothing moved. Purbright reread his notes. Mercy Platt, tidy widow, fond of remedies. Bottle with half a label at a meeting run by Mrs. Reckitt. Councillor Dobson, glancing, Miss Slattery certain, Mr. Reckitt relieved too soon. The scrap in his notebook curved toward a thought he did not complete. Morning brought a combing wind and Dr. Vivers, who set his hat down like a cautious diagnosis. "Alkaloid poisoning," he said, "compatible with strychnine or a cousin. Onset quick, tea the likeliest vehicle. Bitter. Very. but people ignore bitterness if the label promises virtue. He examined the bottle. Your chemist's glue is cheap. This torn edge shows a better gum. Also, on the neck, a trace of flavored syrup. Orange. When he had gone, Mally arrived with small facts. Post office stores say Mrs. Dobson's labels have a gold edging. The postmistress adds that Mrs. Platt brought in a small parcel for Mrs. Dobson last week, then took it away again. Conscience making a late collection, said Purbright. Library, Sergeant. Miss Peebles received them with severe civility. Mrs. Platt was punctual, she said. Lately she borrowed gardening, obscure saints, and home pharmacopoeia simplified. She also asked for the dietetic gospel. Friction here, Mally asked. On Tuesday, said Miss Peebles. Mrs. Dobson returned overdue, tracts on metabolism, and spoke to Mrs. Platt in a tone I reserve for bindweed. Mrs. Platt flushed. Her last loan. She produced gentle stimulants for the home. A penciled slip lay inside. Tonic, fortify, 5 drops, after tea. Beneath, faint, not again. Purbright replaced it and thanked her. They found Mrs. Dobson in a drawing room that smelt of orange. Inspector, I'm horrified by that poor woman's collapse, she announced. Flaxborough's health is my work. Your cordial reduces excess, asked Purbright. It restores balance. And your labels? Elegant but proper. My husband supervises these matters. Purbright's gaze drifted to a tray of small amber bottles with gold-edged labels. He did not step nearer. You spoke to Mrs. Platt on Tuesday at the library. A coincidence. Did she send you a parcel last week? A parcel? Difficult to recall. She shifted. Of course, he said, rising. We shall return when remembrance feels less strenuous. The Corn Exchange had been set to rights, as if furniture could launder memory. The long table showed an oval brown bloom where tea had once been. The caretaker coughed. After they took her, I picked up the saucer, and this fell out. He produced a teaspoon wrapped in paper. The bowl shone tackily along one edge. Didn't seem decent to leave it. Purbright held it to the light. A faint medicinal scent rose beneath the orange. Thank you, he said. Decency improves the chain of evidence. He sent Mally to Dr. Viva's with the spoon and walked to Reckitt's. Mr. Reckitt's relief returned the moment the bell tinkled. Inspector, I was just thinking of you. You relieve people with admirable economy, said Purbright. Mrs. Platt's records, if you please. They went through the ledger in a back room. Tonics, a sleeping draught, liniment, no strychnine salts recorded. Halfway down the page, a blank line where a renewal should have been. She came in yesterday, Reckitt murmured. Wanted the restorative again. I refused. She said she had some left. From where, if not here? Asked Purbright. Do you supply Mrs. Dobson with ingredients? Glycerin and syrup, perhaps. Nothing dangerous. Quite. Outside, the wind tugged at his coat and carried a thread of orange along the street like a rumor trying to be believed. Somewhere among labels, cordial, and a spoon that tasted of virtue, Mercy Platt had drawn a line she meant not to cross again, and someone had moved the line for her. Purbright walked on, thinking quietly. Purbright left the library with the scented envelope in his pocket and the impression that courtesy had been working overtime. The afternoon was sharp. The high street looked scrubbed. At the station, he laid the envelope beside the spoon's report and the gold-edged scrap, aligning their corners as if they might admit acquaintance. Sergeant, he said, bring me the lad who carries errands for those who oughtn't to be seen carrying them. Mally returned with Stanley Burt, who stood before the desk as though conscience were invigilating. I fetch things for Mrs. Dobson, Stanley said. Monday I took a flat packet from the printer. Yesterday a note to Miss Peebles to be put inside a book for Mrs. Platt. The note smelt of orange. I can't read the curly kind. Any syrups lately? Last week. Big jar. You hug it or it sulks. Purbright let him go with a coin and a remark about Honesty's odd habit of paying. He and Mally visited Wilkes the printer. Mr. Wilkes produced an invoice with care. "Mrs. Dobson's labels," he said. "Gold border, brisk script, stronger gum." She left a sample with thicker edging. Wanted. The border slimmer for small bottles. "Reckitt's. Orders plain by post. I've never printed for him." Back at the station, a telegram from Dr. Vevers waited. "Strychnine like alkaloid. Trace citrus oil." He looked again at the envelope, the scrap, the report. The three behaved like polite conspirators. "Castle Crescent," he said. Mrs. Dobson received them in a room that smelled of orange and intention. Small amber bottles stood in orderly ranks. "You have come to spare me distress," she said. "To be spared ourselves," said Purbright. "Your restorative wears a handsome label." "Presentation reassures," she said. "People obey what looks reliable. And what smells agreeable." "A hint of refinement," she said. "It steadies resolve. You wrote to Mrs. Platt yesterday." "I write to many," she said. "Encouragement is not subversive." Purbright placed the envelope on the table. Its seal confessed discreetly to prior curiosity. A private encouragement that took a quiet route. "My letters are private. Until they trouble public rooms," he answered gently, and let his glance rest on a teaspoon drying on a saucer, its bowl still tacky. "Donations fund your cordial." "Only costs." "How civic." "Your husband." "At the council." "We shall admire him," said Purbright. Outside, Mally exhaled. "She's careful, sir." "Care is persuasive," said Purbright. "We must decide whom it persuades." They found Councillor Dobson after the clerk had performed several evasions. "Inspector," he said, "what service?" "Tell us what you posted Tuesday," said Purbright, "and why your wife's labels needed stronger glue." "Routine letters," Dobson answered. "Housekeeping. My wife manages her small activities without my oversight." "You noticed Mrs. Platt's bottle at the ladies' circle." "I notice everything," he said. "It saves trouble later." "Excellent. Please notice whether Mrs. Platt owed money and let me know." They left him to his influence. At the station, Purbright arranged his three objects again. "Mask bitterness," he said. "Advertise virtue. Coach timing with a note, then offer hospitality." Mally frowned. If she meant to die, would she choose an audience? "She wrote, 'Not again in a book,'" said Purbright. "Regret prefers privacy." "One more call," he added. Miss Slattery was locking the chemist's door. She regarded them as she regarded dosages. "You'll want accuracy," she said. "When customers stop a tonic," Purbright asked, "do they bring back the bottle?" "The tidy do," she said. "Mrs. Platt returned hers last week and said she'd no more need." Mr. Reckitt marked the ledger. She looked relieved, then cross for being so. She had another little bottle she did not return. "Could you tell whose?" "I won't. Swear. It glittered in a way ours don't." "Gold edging," Mally tried. "Something that caught the light," she said. She hid it when she saw me see. "Thank you." Purbright tipped his hat. At the next lamp, he stopped. "Tomorrow," he said, "Dr. Vevers will tell me whether this paper carries the same citrus as the spoon. If it does, we shall ask Mrs. Dobson why refinement travelled into the wrong teacup. Meanwhile, keep an ear to the council. Heroism often leaves a smear on petty cash." Mally nodded, cheered by the prospect of arithmetic. They parted at the station steps. Purbright remained a moment, watching the high street behave like a town that disapproves of drama and manufactures it anyway. He put the envelope back in his pocket and felt its ordinary weight. He did not open it. Some letters are more eloquent unopened. They lie on a desk and summon the people who wrote, carried, and read them to repeat their movements. He preferred to listen to that choreography a little longer. In Flaxborough, patience applied tidily. was usually the shortest road. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station the next morning to find the air faintly scented with disinfectant and brewing tea. Flaxborough's twin guarantees of civic order. On his desk lay Dr. Weaver's latest note, its brevity suggesting the man had been pressed for time or patience. Residue on spoon matches compound in deceased stomach. Bitter alkaloid masked with citrus essence. Source not pharmaceutical. Purbright read it twice, though the conclusion had already found a comfortable chair in his mind the previous night. Sergeant Malley entered with his usual air of dutiful puzzlement. "Morning, sir. Weaver's telephoned again. Said the alkaloid might be synthetic. Something not listed in the standard poison tables." "Then perhaps it was intended to avoid them," Purbright said. He folded the note carefully, slipping it into his inside pocket. "We shall have to assume that Mrs. Platt didn't purchase virtue from a recognized source." Malley nodded, unsure whether that was an observation or a directive. "Do we call on Mrs. Dobson again?" "Not quite yet. I prefer to see her shadow before she knows she's casting one. There's a clerk at the town hall, Hopgood, I believe, who handles the councillor's permits and correspondence. Fetch him in for a chat about public health forms and any recent applications to sell tonics." By mid-morning, Hopgood was seated before Purbright's desk, a pinkish man whose nervous smile could have been mistaken for indigestion. "Permits, Inspector?" "Oh yes, plenty of those. Mrs. Dobson renewed hers last month, strictly for dietary cordials. Non-medicinal, you understand." Purbright's expression was kindly. "Of course. And the husband, Councillor Dobson, he signs these?" "Well, not officially, but he does rather supervise. Takes an interest, likes things in order, you might say." Hopgood hesitated, then added with the bashful pleasure of a man about to share gossip under the protection of civic duty. "They're both terribly particular about presentation, the Dobsons. Every label gold-edged. She said it lent credibility. He said it lent influence." "An interesting division of labor," murmured Purbright. "Thank you, Mr. Hopgood. You've lent both." When the clerk had gone, Malley looked expectant. "Shall I take that as confirmation, sir?" "You may take it as seasoning. We're nearly ready to serve the dish." Purbright walked out into the mild drizzle that had begun to stipple the pavements. Across the road, Mrs. Gloss was arranging lilies that looked too white to be quite innocent. As he passed, she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Terrible business, Inspector. Poor Mrs. Platt. They say she'd been helping Mrs. Dobson with that slimming club, testing recipes, you know. My cousin swears she bought bottles of that cordial by the dozen. And then, well, look how it ends." Purbright smiled faintly. "Civic-mindedness can be fatal, Mrs. Gloss. Best to confine oneself to flowers." He continued toward the Dobsons' house on Castle Crescent, its front garden manicured into moral geometry. Through the window, he saw Mrs. Dobson seated at her writing desk, head bowed, pen moving with tidy insistence. A faint reflection caught in the glass. Councillor Dobson himself, pacing behind her, gesturing with an irritation disguised as husbandly concern. Purbright did not ring. Observation, properly brewed, often produced a stronger effect than interrogation. At the chemist's, Miss Slattery greeted him with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been professionally confirmed. "I thought you'd be back, Inspector. Mr. Reckitt's been up since dawn rechecking his stock. You'd think the devil himself had crawled into the glycerin jars." "Perhaps he did," said Purbright mildly, "and found them well labelled." Reckitt emerged, pale but eager to be cooperative. "Inspector, I've discovered something most irregular. One of my smaller syrup bottles, unaccounted for. I checked the ledger twice. It must have gone astray last week." "Stolen?" He hesitated. "Or borrowed. Occasionally my wife lends a little for Mrs. Dobson's mixtures. Nothing sinister, of course. Just a neighbourly arrangement." "Of course," said Purbright. "Neighbourliness like virtue, often becomes more interesting when shared. He left Reckitt to his discomfort and returned to the station where Mally was waiting with another telegram, this one from the pharmacy laboratory in Lincoln. Trace's match compound registered to private tonic. Orange elixir, distributor Mrs. C. Dobson, Flaxborough. Purbright's eyebrows lifted no higher than decency permitted. "Ah, the tonic of respectability," he murmured. "A familiar prescription." He spent the afternoon composing a memorandum to the county medical officer, written in the calm, elaborate hand of a man who never hurried his revelations. When it was done, he placed it neatly to one side and looked out of the window. The light was thinning. Flaxborough, as ever, was winding itself tidily toward evening, its sins preparing to sleep behind lace curtains. "Mally," he said at last, "we shall need to pay a formal visit tomorrow. Mrs. Dobson's recipes have strayed beyond the culinary. But before that, have another look at Councillor Dobson's accounts, anything resembling a purchase of chemical supplies, syrup quantities, or envelopes. There's usually a bill that forgets to lie." Mally left, already enthused by the promise of receipts. Purbright remained, his gaze on the rain tracing slow, deliberate paths down the glass. In his mind's ledger, the entries were aligning, a cordial, sweetened to mask bitterness, a woman eager for health, persuaded by civility, a chemist's wife lending materials in the name of propriety, and behind it all, the quiet collaboration of respectability and greed. He took from his pocket the small scrap of gold-edged label he had found near the chemist's gutter. Turning it over in the lamplight, he saw for the first time a sliver of the printed word that the tear had concealed. It read, simply, "Vitality." Purbright smiled. "Indeed," he murmured. "Flaxborough has always had too much vitality. It merely changes form." He extinguished the lamp, leaving the office in the soft dusk. Outside, the town clock struck 6 with the weary precision of conscience keeping time. The investigation was beginning to breathe more freely now, as if the air itself had decided to cooperate. Quietly, decorously, but with a purpose that would soon find its voice. The next morning dawned with a clarity that Flaxborough seldom trusted. Even the pigeons on the town hall roof appeared unusually alert, as if the air itself had begun whispering confidences. Inspector Purbright, punctual as always, entered his office at 9 precisely to find Sergeant Mally already there, surrounded by papers that exuded the faintly guilty smell of carbon copies and municipal stationery. "Morning, sir. I've been through Councillor Dobson's accounts, as you asked. You were right. He's not as tidy with money as he is with speeches. There's a payment here to a chemical supplier in Leeds. 2 drums of citric base, 1 case of organic compounds for food use, whatever that means. The invoice went through his wife's wellness society. Paid in cash." Purbright eased himself into his chair, steepling his fingers with mild satisfaction. A most robust appetite for health. And the timing? Delivered 2 weeks before Mrs. Platt's death. Then Mrs. Dobson's cordial may have been both home-brewed and council-approved. Tell me, does the invoice mention strength or concentration? Mally shook his head. "No, sir, but the supplier's note says, 'Handle with care. Volatile in mixture.' That doesn't sound much like a slimming tonic to me." "Unless one measures weight loss by finality," said Purbright dryly. He rose, gazing out at the high street where the milk cart was making its rounds with the complacent rhythm of a process that had never once been questioned by the law. "Fetch me Mrs. Reckitt, if she can be persuaded. We'll ask her about her generosity with syrups, and about her social circle." Half an hour later, Mrs. Reckitt entered the office like an offended matron inspecting an unfamiliar pew. She was dressed in a shade of mauve that spoke of mourning only as a fashion exercise. "Inspector, this is all most distressing," she began. "I cannot think why you persist in connecting my poor husband's shop with that woman's unfortunate end." "Because, madam," said Purbright with unfailing courtesy, "it is by connecting small things that one avoids misunderstanding large ones. You lent Mrs. Dobson certain supplies? Her lips tightened. A little syrup, some glycerin, perfectly harmless items. She said they were for demonstrations, not for public sale. And you believed her? Of course, one must show neighborly trust. Purbright regarded her mildly. In Flaxborough, Mrs. Reckitt, neighborly trust is the most dangerous narcotic of all. Do you recall any mention of Mrs. Platt in your conversations? A brief hesitation flickered in her eyes. Only that Mrs. Dobson spoke kindly of her. She said Mrs. Platt was to be her example of progress. A testimonial, I think she called it. Indeed. Purbright's tone did not change, but the phrase settled in his mind like a pin finding its proper hole. Thank you, Mrs. Reckitt. That may be all for now. When she had gone, Mally said, You think Mrs. Platt was being used, sir? I think she was being improved upon, said Purbright. Some people can't resist editing their friends once they've outgrown them. The rest of the morning passed in quiet industry. Letters were dispatched, a discreet inquiry sent to the lead supplier, and Dr. Vivers promised a final report by evening. By 3 o'clock, the telephone rang with a thin, precise buzz that suggested officialdom rather than urgency. This is Mrs. Dobson, said the voice, cool but edged. I understand you've been making inquiries that concern my business. I must insist you speak with me directly rather than through gossip and subordinates. I was intending to, said Purbright pleasantly. May I call this afternoon? She hesitated. If you must. I must, said Purbright, and replaced the receiver. He and Mally arrived at Castle Crescent shortly before 4. Mrs. Dobson greeted them in a sitting room so immaculate it looked faintly embarrassed to host conversation. The scent of citrus hung in the air like a nervous guest. Inspector, she began with brittle composure, this persecution must end. I run a legitimate enterprise. My cordials are beneficial, entirely natural, and quite harmless if used as directed. I see. And Mrs. Platt used them as directed. I cannot be responsible for every foolish woman who misreads a label. Purbright smiled faintly. Yet you wrote her letters, gave her samples, made her your example of progress. That suggests a certain responsibility. Her eyes flashed. I offered her improvement. If she abused it, that is not my crime. Abuse? Purbright repeated softly. You mean she took more than advised? I mean she was weak. She wanted quick results. Attention, admiration. I merely gave her what she asked for. Which was? A stronger tonic. I refused her, naturally. She must have found some other source. Purbright studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket and placed on the table the gold-edged scrap, the envelope, and the laboratory note. All rather persuasive evidence that the other source was closer to home. Her poise faltered. You're twisting things. On the contrary, Mrs. Dobson. I'm straightening them. He rose, his voice gentle but final. Tomorrow morning we shall open your storeroom. I'm sure the county medical officer will be interested in your ingredients and your arithmetic. She drew herself up, pride warring with fear. You have no proof I intended harm. No, said Purbright, picking up his hat, but intent has a curious habit of revealing itself when tidying is attempted. And Flaxborough, as you know, loves things neat. Outside, dusk had begun to thicken over the crescent. The lamps flickered into life, their reflections trembling across the wet pavement. Mally followed in silence until they reached the corner, then said quietly, She looked shaken, sir. Guilt often is, said Purbright, though sometimes it's only the first draft of confession. They walked on, unhurried, the rain whispering against their coats. Behind them in the Dobson house, a single light remained burning, steady, deliberate, and far too bright for comfort. The night settled over Flaxborough with the unconvincing quiet of a town that preferred appearances to peace. At the police station, a single lamp burned in Purbright's office long after the others had gone dark. He sat with his elbows on the blotter, eyes half closed, considering the fine line that ran between enterprise and evil. On the wall behind him, the clock marked each second with the patient obstinacy of official time. At 10:30, the telephone rang, its tone discreetly urgent. Sergeant Malley's voice carried from the other end, edged with apology. "Sorry to disturb you, sir, but Dr. Vivers has just rung from the hospital. Says there's been another incident." Purbright straightened, already reaching for his coat. "Who?" "Mr. Reckitt, sir. Collapsed at home. Same symptoms. The doctor says it looks very like Mrs. Platt's case." "Alive?" "Barely. They've taken him to the infirmary." Purbright replaced the receiver with deliberate care. "Well," he murmured to the empty room, "one can't say the trade lacks consistency." By the time he reached the Reckitt's house, the rain had turned from drizzle to mist, wrapping the street in a soft anonymity. Mrs. Reckitt met him at the door, pale but perfectly composed, a handkerchief pressed to her lips more for decorum than distress. Oh, Inspector, how dreadful! He was just sitting after supper, reading his newspaper when he went quite rigid. The doctor said, "Oh, I can hardly bring myself to repeat it. Poison, he thinks. But that's absurd, isn't it?" "Absurdity," said Purbright mildly, "has never been in short supply in Flaxborough." He stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of menthol and something sweeter, like syrup left too long in the sun. "Did your husband eat or drink anything unusual this evening?" "Only his tonic," she said, glancing toward the sideboard. "He's been taking it for his nerves. Made it up himself, of course. A chemist always trusts his own mixtures." Purbright examined the bottle. It was half empty, the label written in Reckitt's careful hand. Yet beneath the neat black letters, he noticed a faint stain, a gold shimmer that did not belong to the chemist's tidy world. He turned it under the lamplight. "Your husband's handwriting, certainly," he said, "but not his gum, I think. Did anyone else have access to this?" Mrs. Reckitt blinked. "Only myself. And perhaps Miss Slattery, if she tidied the counter. But why would she? Oh, this is monstrous." Purbright closed the bottle and replaced it. "People seldom need a reason that stands up to daylight. Was your husband worried about the inquiry?" She hesitated. "He was uneasy. He said Mrs. Dobson had asked him for something she shouldn't. A preservative, he called it. He refused her, and afterward he said he thought someone had been in the shop after hours. A drawer moved, that sort of thing. I told him he was imagining things." "Most people imagine the truth first," said Purbright gently. "They only call it imagination when it becomes inconvenient." At the infirmary, the night sister met him with a shake of the head. "I'm afraid he's gone, Inspector. Convulsions, same as that other case. Dr. Vivers says he'll perform the post-mortem in the morning, but there's little doubt." Purbright thanked her, then stood for a long moment outside in the hospital courtyard, the rain whispering against the gravel. A second death altered the equation. It was no longer a question of a careless cordial or vanity turned tragic. This was tidying up, decisive, deliberate. Someone was pruning the witness list. He walked back, toward the station through streets empty but for the ghostly outlines of lamplight and puddles. When he arrived, Malley was waiting, eyes heavy with fatigue but alive with speculation. "You think the same person, sir?" "I think coincidence is getting above itself," said Purbright. He placed the bottle on the desk. "Mr. Reckitt's own tonic, though I'd wager the last dose didn't come from his hand. And look, our familiar gold edging again." Malley leaned closer. "That's Dobson's mark." One can achieve immortality in the strangest ways." Purbright made a note, then reached for his hat again. "We'll call on the counsellor before breakfast. He has a tidy mind. Perhaps he's been helping with his wife's accounts." The following morning broke pale and watchful. The Dobson residence looked as though it had held its breath all night. Mrs. Dobson opened the door herself. her face a careful composition of composure and contempt. "Inspector, I do hope this is important. We have had a most trying evening." "I'm aware," Purbright said. "Mr. Reckitt's death has rather altered our perspective. You might wish to adjust yours accordingly." Her hand tightened on the door. "Reckitt? Dead?" "Indeed. A similar ailment to Mrs. Platt's. Rather too similar." From the hallway behind her came a sound, a chair scraping, then the low rumble of Councillor Dobson's voice. "What's this about Reckitt?" he demanded, appearing at her shoulder. Purbright turned to him with polite gravity. "A man in your employ, in a sense, supplier of ingredients for your wife's health enterprise. He appears to have swallowed a dose of his own generosity." Dobson's face darkened. "If you're suggesting, I seldom suggest, Councillor. I prefer to ask." Purbright's gaze shifted to the writing desk, visible through the open door. A pile of letters lay there, the topmost bearing the gold-edged label of Orange Vitality Tonic. "Might we step inside? I promise to tread carefully." Mrs. Dobson's voice was brittle as sugar. "We've nothing to hide." "Splendid," said Purbright. "Then perhaps you won't mind if we begin with these." He gestured toward the letters. A cordial exchange, one might say. She hesitated, then stepped back. Purbright entered, Mally close behind. The faint smell of orange filled the air again, cloying now as though the house itself were exhaling guilt. Purbright laid a gloved hand on the nearest letter. The seal was fresh. Addressed not to a customer, but to Mrs. Ada Reckitt. He looked up. "Well, well," he said softly. "Flaxborough's commerce in virtue seems remarkably circular." Mrs. Dobson's lips parted, but no sound came. Councillor Dobson's hand, large and damp, twitched once against the door frame. Outside, a milk cart rattled past, oblivious, and somewhere a church bell began to strike 9, each chime marking the slow tightening of the circle closing neatly, inexorably, around them. The letter lay on the desk like a confession dressed for Sunday. Purbright regarded it without touching, his eyes mild but intent. Mrs. Dobson hovered nearby, pale beneath her usual armor of civility, while her husband shifted restlessly at her shoulder, as though considering whether outrage might yet restore order. "An innocent correspondence," she said at last, her voice brittle, each word arranged with care. "I wrote to Mrs. Reckitt after the tragedy, purely an expression of sympathy. One does what one can." "Commendable," Purbright murmured, "though the ink seems impatient for the post. May I?" She hesitated just long enough to betray calculation, then gestured with reluctant grace. "If you must." Purbright lifted the letter, reading only the first lines. "My dear Ada, we must both be strong. We did what we could to help her, and no one can expect us to answer for the foolishness of others." He folded it again, the faint scent of orange clinging to the paper like a signature. "A comforting sentiment," he said. "Particularly the notion of shared innocence. It's a sentiment, I find, becomes rarer with practice." Dobson drew himself up, his councillor's voice swelling. "Inspector, this tone of insinuation has gone far enough. My wife's enterprise has benefited dozens of women in this town, most of them ungrateful if you ask me. If one or two lacked the sense to follow directions, that hardly constitutes a crime." "I quite agree," Purbright said evenly, "but it does suggest an unusual pattern of misfortune among your clientele. Mrs. Platt, Mr. Reckitt, perhaps others who lacked both sense and survival. You understand, Councillor, that repetition is rarely an accident." Dobson's mouth tightened. "You'll need more than gossip and coincidence to make a case." Purbright smiled, faintly courteous. "That's why I came, to collect the rest." He turned to Mrs. Dobson. "I'll need the key to your storeroom, the one containing your ingredients, labels, and syrups. I'm sure you'd prefer to surrender it voluntarily." Her hand went to the chain around her neck, then stopped. "You can't possibly think—" "I prefer not to think," he said. I prefer to observe, and I've observed that in Flaxborough the purest motives are generally stored under lock and key." Without another word, she unclasped the chain and dropped the small brass key into his gloved palm. At the station later that morning, Purbright and Mally examined the contents of the Dobson storeroom, assisted by Dr. Vevers, who had come armed with an expression of professional resignation. The shelves were lined with jars and bottles, everyone meticulously labelled Vitality Tonic, Restorative Elixir, Orange Essence, Natural Reducer. Vevers uncorked one of the smaller bottles and sniffed. The base is glycerin and citrix, syrup, as expected. But this... He dipped a glass rod into the mixture and frowned. "There's an additive here that doesn't belong, not natural. Synthetic strychnine compound, cleverly masked, very low concentration, but cumulative. Take it daily, and, well, you've seen the result." "Mrs. Platt's tonic," said Purbright quietly. "And now Reckitt's." Mally, who had been sorting through the labels, looked up. "Sir, there's a batch here with Reckitt's handwriting on them. See, his neat loops and those black capitals. Only the gum on these isn't his. Gold edging again. They've been glued over the originals." "Covering tracks," Purbright murmured. "A substitution, perhaps. One bottle for another." Vevers straightened. "Whoever did this knew the quantities. That's not guesswork. It's a pharmacist's hand." Purbright nodded slowly. "Or someone married to one." He thanked the doctor and sent Mally to have the remaining bottles sealed for evidence. Then, after a moment's reflection, he returned alone to Castle Crescent. The door opened before he knocked. Mrs. Dobson stood there, pale and composed, as if she'd been expecting him. "You've found what you came for," she said. "Not quite everything," Purbright replied. "There's still the matter of why." She led him to the sitting room without protest. "Because I was tired," she said simply. "Tired of being overlooked, patronized, laughed at. My husband plays the statesman, my customers the martyrs, and all the while I do the work. I made something people wanted, and they still treated it as vanity. Mercy Platt wanted results. She begged for strength, beauty, attention. I gave her what she asked for. She took too much, perhaps, but she wanted too much. And Reckitt." She hesitated, eyes flickering. "He was going to tell you. He said I'd tampered with his mixtures. He threatened to ruin me. So yes, I went to see him. He was reading his newspaper, as always. I poured a little cordial in his glass. It was only meant to make him ill, to frighten him into silence. But apparently, my proportion was less precise than his." Purbright regarded her with quiet sadness. "Precision, Mrs. Dobson, is seldom compatible with passion. You might have prospered as a chemist had you not been so enthusiastic a moralist." She gave a short, brittle laugh. "And what will you do now? Arrest me before the luncheon crowd?" "After it," he said mildly. "Flaxborough dislikes interruptions at mealtimes." As he led her out into the damp afternoon, Councillor Dobson appeared on the landing, grey-faced and unsteady. "Clara, what have you done?" "What you never could," she said without looking back. "Taken responsibility." The words hung in the hall like the faint tang of citrus, sharp and lingering. At the station, Purbright seated her in the small interview room, its walls an uninspiring shade of council beige. She sat upright, hands folded neatly, as if preparing for a committee meeting. "You see," she said softly, almost confiding, "I never meant for anyone to die. I only wanted to prove that respectability can be a poison too." "And I succeeded, didn't I?" Purbright looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Dobson, though not, perhaps, in the way you intended." Outside, the town clock began to strike noon. The sound travelled through the open window, mingling with the hum of the market and the faint rustle of gossip already beginning to spread. Flaxborough, ever adaptable, was ready once more to turn tragedy into conversation, and conversation into memory. Purbright closed his notebook, the faint scent of orange still clinging to his sleeve. "Mally," he said quietly, "put on the kettle. We'll have time before the paperwork starts." And as the first hiss of steam rose from the kettle in the next room, Inspector Purbright allowed himself a small, tired smile, the kind that recognized, without quite approving, the eternal health of human folly. The following morning rose cold and wind-polished, carrying with it the hushed satisfaction of a town that had finally received a story worth retelling. In shop doorways and post office queues, Mrs. Dobson's name was already circulating with that peculiar blend of pity and relish which Flaxborough reserved for the downfall of its more prominent citizens. The Citizen's headline, "Tonic Tragedy, Lady Philanthropist Charged," had achieved what no council meeting could: universal attendance at the breakfast table. Inspector Purbright, however, appeared impervious to the local excitement. He sat at his desk surrounded by neat piles of paperwork, the residue of order following confession. Yet his expression was not one of closure, but of patient disquiet, the look of a man who suspects a puzzle has been solved too easily for comfort. Mally entered with the briskness of one who carried fresh news. "The magistrates remanded her, sir. They've transferred her to county custody till the hearing next week." Purbright nodded. "Good. And the counsellor?" "At home, looking like someone's cancelled Christmas. Keeps repeating that he knew nothing. I almost believe him." "Almost is a useful word," Purbright said. He leaned back, gaze resting on the window where weak light spilled through the glass. "Still, something about his wife's candour troubles me." "Troubles you, sir?" "She admitted everything." "Confessions," said Purbright, "are like cosmetics, Sergeant. They improve the surface while concealing the deeper blemishes. She admitted to motive, opportunity, even method, but not to origin. How did she learn about the compound, for example? Not from her correspondence course in dietary science, I'd wager." Mally frowned. "You think someone helped her?" "I think," Purbright said, slowly, "that Mr. Reckitt was not the only chemist in Flaxborough to display professional curiosity." A soft knock interrupted them. Miss Teetle from the station reception appeared, clutching a folded note. "Message from the infirmary, sir. Dr. Vevers asks if you'd call on him. Urgent." Purbright rose at once. "There you have it, Mally. The dead, you'll find, are often the best witnesses once given proper encouragement." At the infirmary, Vevers met them in his small laboratory, a space fragrant with carbolic and tobacco. He held a file marked Reckitt, Post-Mortem Supplementary. "I thought you'd finished with him," Purbright said. "So did I," the doctor replied. "But something nagged. You recall that bottle you brought me, the one labelled in Reckitt's hand? I tested the residue again. You were right, the gum was different, but what's interesting is the handwriting." Purbright waited. "It isn't Reckitt's," Vevers said. "Not entirely. Someone traced over it, copied his style, but too carefully. Under magnification, you can see the hesitation in each loop. And the ink, newer by at least a day." Purbright's brows lifted a fraction. So the label was rewritten after the bottle was filled. Precisely. A forgery meant to look domestic. "Then Mrs. Dobson didn't poison Reckitt," said Mally, startled. Purbright smiled faintly. "Oh, she did, just not by her own hand." He thanked the doctor, pocketed the file, and walked out into the cold air. For a long moment he stood on the hospital steps, watching the wind push thin clouds across a washed-out sky. Then he said, "Sergeant, fetch Mrs. Reckitt." When she arrived at the station, Mrs. Reckitt had exchanged mourning mauve for sober black, a choice that lent her an air of tragic dignity she seemed to find becoming. She sat straight-backed before Purbright's desk, gloved hands resting like folded verdicts in her lap. "Mrs. Reckitt," Purbright began mildly, You were most helpful during our earlier inquiries. But since then, new information has come to light. Information that suggests your late husband's death may have been assisted." Her eyes flickered, but she said nothing. "I wonder," Purbright went on, "whether you can recall exactly where you obtained that bottle of tonic he drank." "I told you," she said sharply. "It was from his own batch. He made it for himself." Purbright nodded. "Yes, that's what the label claimed. A very neat imitation of his handwriting, too. But the ink was too fresh. Someone prepared that label after he filled the bottle. Perhaps the same person who wanted him to take a final, fatal dose." Her mouth tightened. "Are you accusing me, Inspector?" "Not yet," he said pleasantly. "But I do notice that grief, like handwriting, sometimes bears the marks of rehearsal." The silence stretched until it seemed to acquire its own temperature. Then, with a long sigh that seemed part surrender, part irritation, she said, "He was going to ruin us, Inspector. Do you understand? Years of work, his reputation, our standing. He was terrified after that woman died. He said he'd been careless with stock, that they'd call him a murderer. I begged him to go to you, to tell the truth. But he was too proud. He said he'd rather die than face disgrace." "So you helped him?" Purbright asked softly. "I helped him," she said. "He'd already mixed his draft. I only altered the dose. I told myself it would be merciful, quick. He'd sleep and never wake, but it wasn't quick." She looked away, eyes dry and fierce. "He shouldn't have suffered. I didn't mean that." Mally shifted uneasily, but Purbright remained still. "And Mrs. Dobson?" he asked at last. "She knew. I told her afterward. She said it was Providence, that it freed us both from scandal. She begged me not to speak of it, for her sake and mine. I thought it was over." Purbright closed his notebook gently. "Flaxborough has a way of continuing things, Mrs. Reckitt. It dislikes abrupt endings." As she was led away, the town clock struck 4, each chime measured, decorous, and faintly reproachful. Outside, a chill drizzle began to fall, flattening the litter in the gutters and softening the edges of the world. Back in his office, Purbright poured himself a cup of tea, added precisely 1 lump of sugar, and sat in silence for a while. Then he said, almost to himself, "Poison seldom stops with the first victim. Respectability, once mixed with fear, is infinitely self-replicating." Mally, uncertain whether that was an observation or an epitaph, said nothing. The kettle hummed quietly between them, and in that small, steady sound the investigation, like Flaxborough itself, seemed to settle, polite and complete on the surface, while something darker stirred gently beneath. The confession of Mrs. Reckitt, though delivered with the air of one who believed she had simply corrected a domestic imbalance, left Inspector Purbright with a familiar unease. He had learned that in Flaxborough, guilt seldom travelled alone. It tended to invite its relations. By the following morning, the case had acquired an unpleasant symmetry. 2 women, each confessing to a death that suited the other's convenience, and a town busily arranging moral justifications over breakfast. At 9 o'clock, Purbright found himself again in his office, the smell of wet overcoats rising from the corridor and mingling with the sharper scent of polish and paperwork. Mally entered, clutching the morning edition of The Citizen, its headline announcing with unearned authority, "Double confession in tonic murders. Inspector Purbright praised for swift justice." "Swift," Purbright remarked mildly, "is not the same as sure." "Sir, I've been thinking, Sergeant. Both women's statements, Mrs. Dobson's and Mrs. Reckitt's, fit too comfortably. Each spares the other from scrutiny. A civic courtesy, perhaps, but rarely the mark of truth." Mally frowned. "You think they're protecting each other?" "Not intentionally. They're protecting themselves from the same shadow. Tell me, where was Councillor Dobson during the period of Mrs. Platt's death?" "At a committee dinner, according to him." Where all alibis bloom, Purbright said. Check the attendance list, quietly. While Malley set about his inquiries, Purbright reread the laboratory reports, his pencil moving idly along the margins. The same compound appeared in all 3 deaths, the tonic's lethal cousin, yet there was no record of its purchase through any legitimate supplier. That suggested someone with access to controlled stock and the confidence to conceal it. The chemist was dead, his widow incapable of synthesis, and Mrs. Dobson's skill limited to decoration. There remained only one figure with both the means and the motive of influence. By afternoon, Malley returned, his expression torn between triumph and alarm. Councillor Dobson never made that dinner. The minutes show he sent his apologies. But the hotel staff say he came in later, after the meal, met with someone briefly in the lounge, then left. Someone? They don't recall who, but the barman remembers a smell. Strong, like orange cordial. Purbright's eyes lifted from his notes. Flaxborough's fragrance of choice. He rose, taking his hat. Fetch the car, Sergeant. We'll trouble the councillor for a final consultation. The Dobson residence, once the emblem of middle-class serenity, now looked like a set awaiting demolition. Curtains were half-drawn, the garden untidy, as though respectability had abruptly resigned. Councillor Dobson received them in his study, a room lined with civic commendations and a decanter half-emptied of something expensive enough to imply innocence. He greeted them with the stiff geniality of a man determined to appear useful to authority. "I take it this is about my wife again," he said. "You've already got her confession. What more can I add?" Purbright regarded him with polite patience. "Only clarification, Councillor. There are still a few inconsistencies. Your wife insists she prepared the tonic herself, yet records suggest the chemical base was not available through her contacts. You wouldn't happen to know where she acquired it?" He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Good heavens, no. I don't interfere in domestic experiments." "Curious," said Purbright. "You interfered enough to arrange her permits, her invoices, her labels. One might think you were a silent partner." Dobson's hand tightened on the decanter stopper. "Administrative oversight, Inspector. A husband's duty." "Ah," Purbright murmured. "Then perhaps you'll recall the night of Mrs. Platt's death. The hotel dinner. Yes, I was delayed by council work. So we were told. Unfortunately, the council minutes record no such meeting. You did, however, visit the lounge. You were seen with a woman matching Mrs. Reckitt's description." He stiffened. "Utter nonsense. I—" "Councillor," Purbright interrupted gently, "lying to the police is unbecoming. Lying to oneself, however, seems to have been fashionable in this case. You and Mrs. Reckitt met to discuss Mrs. Dobson's growing ambitions, did you not? Perhaps you feared her schemes might embarrass you publicly. And when Mrs. Platt died, you saw an opportunity, an unfortunate death that could, if managed, remove both threat and temptation." Dobson's face drained. "You have no proof of that?" "Not yet," Purbright admitted. "But your wife's confession was too precise to be sincere. She took responsibility for an act that benefited you more than her. You were her alibi's architect and, I suspect, its inspiration. As for Reckitt, he'd begun to suspect you arranged his wife's little loan of supplies to the Dobsons. He threatened exposure, and exposure, as we both know, is fatal to public service." The councillor's mouth twitched. The performance of outrage faltered. "You're inventing motives." "Flaxborough provides them free of charge," said Purbright, "but facts are less generous. So let's try one. The compound used in all 3 cases was ordered under your name 6 months ago, ostensibly for pest control on municipal property, an odd use of civic funds." The silence stretched. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the half-hour, each note heavy as a verdict. Dobson sank into his chair, eyes fixed on the floor. "She wanted respect," he said quietly. "I only wanted to protect what we had. She was restless, ambitious beyond her station. If people mocked her, they mocked me. So I helped her refine the tonic, made it stronger, cleaner. I didn't mean anyone to die, but when that woman collapsed, Clara said it could be managed. A few quiet adjustments, a little guidance. Then Reckitt, damn fool, threatened to ruin us both. I warned him. He wouldn't listen. Purbright watched him without satisfaction. "And now you've both succeeded," he said. "You've purified everything, your name, your reputation, your wife's future, until nothing remains but guilt." As they led him out, the counsellor paused in the hallway, glancing toward the closed parlour door where his wife's absence hung like a mirror turned to the wall. "She'll never forgive me," he said. "Forgiveness," Purbright replied, "is merely another form of reputation. You'll find it overrated." Outside, the late light stretched thin across the cobbles, and a faint breeze stirred the scent of rain and oranges from the open windows above. Malley, watching his superior, said quietly, "I suppose that's the end of it now, sir." Purbright shook his head. "In Flaxborough, Sergeant, nothing ever ends. It simply goes back to being respectable." Inspector Purbright's report, typed 2 days later in the calm after the storm, was a model of modest prose. There was no mention of heroism or brilliance, only the orderly conclusion of related investigations into deaths by ingestion of an unlicensed compound. The phrasing was typical of him. Even crime, once understood, became a matter of classification. Yet as he signed his name, he felt the familiar tug of melancholy that always accompanied completion. The human heart, he thought, was like Flaxborough's drains. It ran deep, twisted unexpectedly, and gave off a faint odor when disturbed. Mrs. Dobson, after her husband's arrest, had abandoned her composure in favor of silence. She neither wept nor protested, but sat in her cell as if calculating whether tragedy might yet restore her social standing. Her confession, now recanted, seemed merely an extension of the same civic instinct that had once adorned her tonic bottles: respectability at any cost. Her husband, meanwhile, awaited trial under the gloom of headlines describing him as a pillar undermined. The town, having exhausted its shock, settled quickly into moral recuperation. The ladies' pharmaceutical circle reconvened, this time to vote on whether the society's funds might be used to erect a modest bench in memory of Mrs. Platt, though opinion was divided on whether to inscribe her name. The chemist's shop reopened under new management. Miss Slattery, now in charge, displayed a small placard reading, "No advice without prescription." On an afternoon softened by rain, Purbright strolled past the Corn Exchange, where a faint brown stain on the floor still resisted both soap and forgetting. He paused, gazing at the empty room. It had the atmosphere of an event that, though regrettable, had done the town no lasting harm, rather like a scandal that improved circulation. Malley joined him, hat askew, face puzzled by thought. "So that's it then, sir. All three accounted for." "Accounted for, yes," said Purbright. "Explained, not quite." "How do you mean?" Purbright smiled faintly. "You'll find that in Flaxborough, Sergeant, explanation is merely the polite form of disbelief. We prefer our motives respectable, envy dressed as civic duty, greed disguised as virtue. It makes conversation easier." They walked on toward the police station. Passing the flower shop, Mrs. Gloss called out a greeting and offered a chrysanthemum for the inspector's patience. He accepted it gravely. A little further along, the postmistress waved him over with a tidbit of gossip. Mrs. Peebles from the library had been reading up on toxic marriages and claimed the Dobson story was practically educational. Purbright thanked her kindly and continued, the flower drooping from his hand like an exhausted witness. Back at the station, he found a letter on his desk, forwarded from the county offices. It was from Dr. Vivers, dry as dust, but with a line that made Purbright's eyebrows lift. Preliminary toxicology on remaining cordial batches shows traces of morphia in addition to alkaloid compound. Suggests adulteration not by chemist's hand, but later handling. Purbright stared at the page for a long moment, then chuckled quietly. Even villains are rarely consistent, he said aloud. Someone always improves the recipe. Malley looked up from his paperwork. Something amiss, sir. Only human nature, said Purbright. It refuses to be tidied. He folded the letter, placed it carefully in his drawer, and locked it. There was no need to reopen the matter now. The Dobsons would pay their civic debt, Mrs. Reckitt her private one, and Flaxborough, ever adaptable, would absorb both into its polite geography of moral instruction. To disturb it further would be unseemly. Late that evening, as dusk turned the town's brickwork to the color of cooling embers, Purbright walked home by way of the canal. The water, still and faintly scummed with autumn leaves, reflected the lamps in long, trembling streaks. Somewhere in the distance, a train gave its soft, departing whistle, the sound fading like a thought half-finished. He paused by the railing, lighting his pipe, the smoke curling upward into the mist. The town behind him was settling once more into its tranquil pattern. Shop shutters closing, gossip winding down, sins turning into anecdotes. Respectability, he mused, was a tonic no one in Flaxborough could resist, and like all tonics, it required only one missing label to become poisonous. He drew in the smoke, watching it drift across the canal. Prescription for death, he murmured to himself, almost approvingly. Though one wonders who wrote it first, the chemist or the patient. A faint smile touched his face, one of quiet irony rather than triumph. He flicked the last of the ash into the water, turned up his collar, and walked on through the mist toward the soft, forgiving glow of the police station windows. Inside waited the same kettle, the same ledgers, the same patient order. Outside, Flaxborough slept under its usual deceptive calm. Purbright, ever the town's unacknowledged conscience, disappeared into the doorway and closed it quietly behind him.